This is Hypnotic Stories, Episode 4, titled, I Bet You Didn't Know It, But I'm a Fiddle Player Too.
Story of the Week is your treasure trove of hypnotic storytelling for change work and self-improvement. Here's your host, Master Storyteller, James Hazlerig.
Hi, welcome to Episode 4, titled, I Guess You Didn't Know It, But I'm a Fiddle Player Too. Which is a phrase I get to use from time to time. It's kind of fun. In this episode, I'm going to tell some stories that are related to playing the fiddle and the violin, and really related to art in general. I'm also going to be making some announcements about new ways that you can find this podcast and subscribe, and also some of the upcoming dates when I'll be speaking and presenting on various different topics. You know, some people, they're a little shy about calling me a fiddler or calling my instrument a fiddle because they think that's somehow low class. Actually, the word fiddle has been in the English language longer, much longer than the word violin, and it's got a great pedigree. I love that word, fiddle, and it describes what I do. Because, you know, a violinist plays classical music and plays what is written out by the composer. It's already there. A fiddler plays in a folk style, which means that he's free to improvise, free to make up things on the spot. So fiddlers, I feel like, have a lot more freedom than violinists. In fact, the way I think about it, you know, you can buy a book full of fiddle tunes, and that's great. It's a great historical record. It's a great way to transmit information. But really, they're kind of like scripts. You can take a look at a fiddle tune, and you can learn a lot from it and get the kernel of what someone else was doing. But then, to really be good, you have to make it your own. You have to be ready to improvise and change it up a little bit. You know, the metaphor of a cook versus a chef is one that my teacher Scott Sandlin is very fond of. And, you know, you can have a book full of recipes, and cooks can follow recipes, just the way that many a violin student can pick up a book of fiddle tunes and read through and think that they're playing the fiddle, but they're not really fiddling. But to be a chef, to be a fiddler, to be a real hypnotist, you have to learn how to step away from those prescribed recipes and written down tunes and really find that fire within and let it live for you. Because fiddlers, storytellers, hypnotists, we are all artists. And you know, I work with quite a few artists and creative types in my practice, and I really love that because, you know, it just resonates very well for me. And so sometimes I find that some of the stories that I know really speak to the heart of what it is to be an artist. And so that's what today's stories are going to focus on. Enjoy. Well, I guess you didn't know it, but I'm a fiddle player too. Well, we've all heard about the famous time that the devil went down to Georgia and how he lost a fiddle contest and a fiddle made of gold to old Johnny, that fiddler there. But, you know, the truth is, to become a great artist, you don't defeat your inner demons, you enlist them. But that story about selling your soul to the devil at the crossroads, that's a pretty old one, long before Robert Johnson is said to have done it in Mississippi so he could become that legendary blues guitarist. The classical violinist Paganini did it. And old Paganini, he was a scary guy. At the end of his concerts, he would take a pair of scissors and he would cut 3 of the 4 strings on his violin, and he would play all of it, all of that next piece, on one string. And let me tell you, when you have no other options left, you can be pretty darn inventive on just one string. But I guess for as long as we've had people playing strings for music, and as long as we've had crossroads, it's been known that to become great, you've got to go down to that crossroads of your life, at that point where you've got to turn one way or the other and make a complete, soul-level, lifelong commitment to walking one path. That's how you become great. And of course, once you've headed down that path, you really can't unring that bell. Now, of course, legend says that it's best to do that under the full moon. And if you're in a situation right now where you can close your eyes, then go ahead and do it. Of course, if you're driving, just listen with your eyes open and pay attention to the road, because you know a crossroads might be coming up for you. But if you can, close your eyes and just imagine that there is a window in your forehead and you're looking at the full moon through that window. And the full moon is slowly getting smaller and smaller and farther away. Because you know the Aztecs told a story about how there was a clever trickster, probably played the fiddle anyway, and that trickster played kind of a prank on a big, strong, dumb warrior, and the warrior went chasing him all over the place. And just as the trickster was almost caught, he turned into a rabbit. And he jumped so high to get away from that warrior that he went smack dab into the moon. That's why the moon has the print of a rabbit. Now, in Europe, they saw a man in that moon, but in the Americas, they saw a rabbit. Now, over in Asia, they saw a magical rabbit with a mortar and pestle grinding medicine to heal the wounded earth. Of course, science tells us that the moon is actually getting a little bit farther away from the earth all the time, at about the rate of around a centimeter every year, so about a meter every century. So as you gaze up at that moon through the window in your forehead, you can let yourself live the ages and let it get smaller and smaller as you go deeper and deeper into these stories. Knowing that in ancient times that moon must have been huge, must have shone almost as bright as day when it was full and you stood under it at midnight, pledging your path on the crossroads. Now for me, it wasn't a literal crossroads, it was a violin teacher. I took my first lessons from my mother, but pretty soon she said, no, you need to go to somebody who specializes in violin. So I went to the home of a fine lady named Erlinda Alderete, a very musical name that, and she taught me how to play the violin, which eventually led to me playing the fiddle. And you know, she spent most of her life living in a little town there on the border with Mexico, and she always dreamed of going to a concert, though, in Carnegie Hall, and hearing one of those great virtuoso violinists playing a Stradivarius violin. And so she saved up her money from all the lessons she taught to me and all of the other kids around the town. And eventually she got a plane ticket, and she got a ticket for a concert at Carnegie Hall. And while she was there in New York City, she got a little bit lost. She didn't know, of course, that the smart thing to do is just hail a cab, so she was trying to find her way on foot to Carnegie Hall and getting completely lost. And what's even worse is it started raining. So she was there in a strange city, hurrying around in the rain, really hoping that she didn't miss out on that concert, and wondering if there was anyone that she could ask directions from. But, you know, not being from New York City, she was a little shy about talking to strangers, until she heard a beautiful sound coming through the water, mixed in with the sound of all of the raindrops on the roofs and all of the water in the gutters. She heard the beautiful sound of a fiddle playing. And as she went closer, she saw that standing underneath a little awning, there was a street musician playing his heart out. And she said, he'll know. He'll know how to get to the concert. And so she went over to him, and she put $1 in his hat and said, "Hey, how do you get to Carnegie Hall?" And that fiddler stopped and looked at her. Now, this fiddler was actually an immigrant from Norway, and he was playing one of those amazing Norwegian fiddles that look so beautiful and have 8 or 9 strings. Some of them you don't even touch with the bow. They just sound in harmony and sympathy with the other notes that you play. Now, in Norway, there's a great tradition about how you become a fiddler. It doesn't involve a crossroads, but it does involve the full moon at midnight, traditionally on a Thursday night. And so when he was a little boy, his uncle, who was a fiddler, asked him, "Is that what you really want to be? Do you truly desire to be a fiddler?" And he said, "Yes, uncle, more than anything." So his uncle took him on a journey one Thursday. He told him, "Don't eat anything and carry this pack." And inside the pack there was a leg of lamb all wrapped up in mint leaves with cloth all around it. And there was a bottle full of mead, which is that honey wine that people in Norway have been drinking ever since the Viking Age and before it. And the boy was pretty happy to know that there was some food involved in this trip, because he wasn't really too fond of missing a meal. I have that in common with him. And so he got hungry as they walked through the village, and his uncle pointed out how to spot which houses were best to play at. And then they walked out of the village and along the road, and his uncle would hum songs to him and ask him to hum them back, until finally they reached the edge of the forest just as night was falling. And the boy was getting pretty hungry at this point. And they walked through the forest quite a long ways, going deeper and deeper down into the forest as the moon slowly, slowly rose. And finally, when the moon was directly overhead at midnight, it shone down full onto a pool of water at the base of a waterfall. And the boy looked at the moon's reflection in it, and he shivered a bit because it was chilly. So he was happy when his uncle said, "Well, gather up some firewood and build a fire and put that leg of lamb to cook." And so that's what he did, and the aroma of that meat went through the whole forest, and it went through that boy's body to every single pore, every single cell, and he was hungry, his stomach was growling. And his uncle took out his fiddle and played a bit, until finally he said, "Do you think the meat's done?" And the boy said, "Well, yes, I think so, and boy, am I hungry." And the uncle said, "Well, all right. Take it off the fire, go over to the waterfall, and throw it in the water." The nephew said, but I'm hungry." And his uncle said, "If you can't skip a meal for your art, you're no true artist." So the boy picked up that leg of lamb and walked over and threw it into the waterfall. Then the uncle said, "Look in the pack and take out that bottle of mead." And he took out the bottle of mead and said, "Pour it into the waterfall." And his nephew said, "But I'm thirsty. We haven't had anything to drink." And the uncle said, "If you can't skip a drink and keep your wits about you when everybody else is dancing and partying and you have to play the fiddle, then you'll never be a fiddler." So the boy poured the mead into the water. And then the uncle reached into his pocket and he took out some gold coins. And he said, "You see this gold? I earned this playing the fiddle. Take it, throw it into the water." And his nephew said, but this is worth something. This is valuable." And the uncle said, If gold is more important to you than music, if money is more than your art, you'll never be a true fiddler, never a true artist. You'll earn plenty, but you must be willing to invest first. And so the boy threw the gold into the waterfall. And his uncle said, "Now we wait to see if the offering is accepted." And the boy said, "Accepted by whom?" The uncle shook his head. "Don't they teach you anything?" "By the Fasagrim, of course, the spirit of the waterfall. You know, the neighbors would call him a troll, and the priest would call him the devil, but our fathers' fathers called him a god. And he has taught every generation of fiddlers in Norway. So now let's sit and wait to see if he'll come forth, and if he does, we know that you're destined to be a great musician." And so he sat and listened and thought and wondered if he would someday be a great musician. You know, a great musician like the one that was in fact playing in Carnegie Hall that night. Playing on a Stradivarius violin, a virtuoso near the end of a long career, 70-plus years old, and yet still an amazing musician. And at the end of his concert, that virtuoso was wiping the rosin off the Stradivarius and loosening the bow hairs, putting it all away, when he heard a little knock on his dressing room door. And thinking it was probably a stagehand bringing some flowers or a gift or something, he said, "Come on in." And he was a bit surprised to see that the man who walked in was in his 50s and very, very well dressed, wearing a fine Italian three-piece suit, clearly a man who was established, a successful businessman. And so the virtuoso said, I wasn't expecting you. What may I do for you?" And the businessman said, "First I have to say it was beautiful to hear you. You were inspiring as you played tonight, as you always do. You play with such fire." The virtuoso smiled and said, Well, thank you." The businessman said, "Now, you don't remember me, of course, but I played for you many years ago when I was still in college. I was majoring in violin, and I aspired to be a great violinist just like you. And you came to my college and you gave a master class, and I played for you. And when I finished, you told me that I lacked fire." The virtuoso swallowed and said, "Well, you're right, I don't remember you, but that seems possible." And the businessman said, "And because you told me that, I put away the violin and I didn't play it anymore. In fact, I switched my major to business, and I pursued it with all my heart, and I met a lovely young woman, and I took a place in her father's business, and I did very well with it, and we got married, I raised children, and I have a wonderful, wonderful life now, a beautiful home, a vacation home as well. We have a yacht. My children are fantastic. My wife, I'm just as much in love with her as the day we met. And I never would have done any of this if you had not told me that I lacked fire. I could have wasted my life trying and failing to be a musician like you." And the virtuoso nodded and said, "Well, I'm glad things have gone well for you." And the businessman said, "But there's just one thing I'm wondering about. It's bothered me all these years. I was good. I played very well. People always said that I had a lot of potential, and yet you said that I lacked fire, and I just want to know, how did you know? How did you know I wasn't cut out for this?" And the virtuoso blushed a bit and said, "Well, In truth, every time an aspiring young violinist plays for me, I tell them that they lack fire. The businessman said, "What? But you mean you just say that to everyone?" And the virtuoso said, "Well, yes." And the businessman said, "But but I could have lived my dreams. I could have been a great virtuoso like you, and you crushed it. You destroyed me. How dare you do such a thing? What gives you the right to tell people those things?" The violinist raised his hand and said, "Shh, I was right. You did lack fire. Because you see, if you had had the fire, you would have ignored what I told you." And so sitting by the fire, that young, aspiring Norwegian fiddler listened to the sound of the waterfall, and he listened to the sounds of the wind rustling the trees, and he listened with his inner ear to a sound of the trees humming a note so deep that the human ear cannot hear it, but not so deep that the human soul cannot appreciate it. And he heard the stars in the heavens singing celestial harmonies. And he knew not how long he sat there until he heard an amazing sound coming out of the water, a roiling and a boiling. And he looked out, opening his eyes, and he saw the Fasagrim, the spirit of the waterfall, rising out of the pool from deep in the unseen depths. The spirit of the waterfall arose, and he was twice 7 feet tall. And on every hand he had 7 fingers, and on every finger 7 knuckles. Every limb had 7 joints. Every eye had 7 pupils. And on each side of his head he had 7 ears, and he was covered in white hair as long and pure as bowstrings. And then when he spoke, it was with a voice like 7 waterfalls. And he asked the boy, "Do you truly wish to be a fiddler, a spellemann, as they call them in Norway?" And the boy said, "Yes, I do." And the Fasagrim said, "Then you must play for me." So the boy took his uncle's fiddle, and he began to play haltingly, awkwardly, out of tune, as so many do when they begin. And when the boy thought that surely he was embarrassing himself and should stop, right then the Fasagrim reached out with those great fingers and took a hold of his right wrist and led the bow gently over the strings to produce beautiful notes. And then the Fasagrim began to turn the pegs to tune the strings into luscious harmonies. And then the Fasagrim snatched the little boy's left hand and took the index finger between his own thumb and finger. And the Fasagrim began to squeeze on that index finger until it grew red with blood, and then it popped and burst, and the blood squirted from it. And the little boy cried out in pain and looked to his uncle for help, but his uncle shook his head and said, "If you wish to be a fiddler, you must bleed upon the strings." And so the Fasagrim snatched up the middle finger and popped it till it bled, and the ring finger and the pinky as well on the left hand, and wiped the blood across the strings, and then said, "Play, play with all your heart, play with all your fire." And the boy, gritting his teeth, pressed the bloody fingers on the strings and began to play with everything he had, and the fire burned within him. And he played fiercely and forcefully all night long. And he played of the songs of birds and the rolling of the waterfall, and he played of the wind in the trees and the stars singing in the sky. And he played of everything that he knew of. He played of his parents and his ancestors and the descendants long to come. And he played all night long until finally the sun arose. And he looked out over the water, seeing that the spirit of the waterfall was gone, and yet it lived within him. And he played a greeting for the sun. And from that day on, he was on the path that he'd taken there at that crossroads to become a fiddler all his days. And so it happened that he was in New York City on that rainy afternoon, playing the fiddle, when my violin teacher asked him, "How do you get to Carnegie Hall?" And so the street fiddler looked at his heavily calloused, once bloody fingers, and he said, "How do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice." I hope you've been enjoying this episode and all of the others. So before we wrap up today, I just want to mention that there are a number of opportunities coming up. And so I just wanted to tell you a little bit about what I've got planned for the rest of this year. On March 21st, those of you in Austin can come join me at the Austin Relaxation Explorers Meetup. They're right there on meetup.com. I'm going to be spending an hour and a half introducing people to laughnosis. That's the intersection between laughter yoga and hypnosis. So that's going to be a heck of a lot of fun. And so if you're in Austin or know a hypnotist in Austin or just somebody who likes to have fun, send them down there to that. That's March 21st. Now, in April, I'll be presenting a 1-hour talk on storytelling for the American Council of Hypnotist Examiners, the ACHE virtual conference. This year they're doing all of that online, so anywhere in the world you can come in and attend and really have a great time with that virtual conference. Now, back to laughnosis, I'd like to mention that in July I'm going to be doing a full-day laughnosis training at Ann King's Hypnosis Center in Boerne, Texas. So if you'd really like to learn more about how to work unconditional laughter into your hypnosis or change work practice, that's going to be a great opportunity. Then, of course, the thing that we wait for all year long, in August, I'll be in Las Vegas for HypnoThoughts Live, and this year I'm going to be doing a 1-day pre-conference class in storytelling. So you're going to get a chance to learn all of my secrets. You're going to get coaching in how to embed suggestions, how to do nested loops, how to create metaphors on the spot. So it's really about helping you to become a spellbinding storyteller. In October, I'll be headed over to Chicago for the Mid-America Hypnosis Conference. I'm very excited. It'll be my first time there, and I'll be doing a 1-hour storytelling presentation, so just a great chance to get wrapped up in some nested loops and have a wonderful time with that. I've also been asked to spend 2 hours introducing people to laughnosis and the power of unconditional laughter in change work. So I'm hoping to see you at one or more of these events this year. Now, if our relationship is to remain entirely virtual and entirely digital, I do want to mention that this podcast is now available on iTunes. So please, if that's how you like to get your podcasts, go subscribe and tell your friends about it as well. And finally, if you have any questions regarding hypnotic storytelling or any comments or feedback, I'd love to hear them. You can email me at harmonyhypnotist@gmail.com. Until next week, enjoy telling stories.
Thanks for listening to the Hypnotic Stories podcast with James Hazlerig. If you've enjoyed this, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share with your friends. For free storytelling tips, go to www.hypnotic-stories.com.